Joining us next is Jill Morris. Jill is Executive Director of PALCI. She's going to be talking about how consortial arrangements are dealing with some of these questions and issues. So Jill, we can see your slides. You should be set to go.
Okay, and you can hear me too, right?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to NISO for having me. I'm certain that many of you here today are participants in a variety of consortia, especially if you're coming from an academic perspective. And for those of you coming from publisher perspectives, I'm sure you have interacted with consortia in a variety of settings. So today I'm hoping to shed a little bit of light on our experience as a consortium dealing with some of the challenges that Brian and Nancy have just been speaking about, and share some of the strategies that we've employed in order to deal with those challenges. And again, my name is Jill Morris. I'm the Executive Director of PALCI. I have worked with this consortium for, well, since 2015, but I've been working with consortia since more than 12 years ago. And I have seen ongoing, access issues that have developed over time. And certainly I've seen a lot of strength in the diversity of perspectives that consortia can bring to these conversations. So I was really excited to hear Brian and Nancy go before me and shed some light on some of those issues. So just to set some context for today's conversation, I want to give you some information about sort of what the PALCI Consortium is all about. We are a 501c3 nonprofit independent organization that is opt-in and voluntary in nature. There's no mandate to participate. And this is different from other consortia that may exist out there. A lot of times my colleagues in consortia will say, if you know one consortium, you know one consortium. Many of us are formed for a variety of different reasons. Within PALCI, we support academic libraries, 71 diverse academic and research libraries. And I'm going to come back and touch on that diversity because I think it plays a real role in the way that we approach some of the challenges that have been addressed today already. And I think it's one of our strengths. So we do focus on a variety of programs here in the PALCI Consortium. You'll see sort of the new acronym that we are starting to use for ourselves, as our old one is a bit outdated now. Partnership for Academic Library Collaboration and Innovation. Originally the Pennsylvania Academic Library Consortium. However, now we support libraries in 4 different states. So we're no longer just Pennsylvania. We do a great deal of work in resource sharing, and that's really the reason that this consortium was originally founded. We literally were shipping materials back and forth to each other. And those shared collections were part of the strength of joining this network. Many of our institutions think about joining PALCI for access to what they think of as sort of their offsite collections, the collections of multiple other institutions that they can provide to their users. And again, early days, this was print. This was very print focused. And clearly that is changing over time. We do a variety of other work as well. And that's changed over more recent years. We do a lot of collaborative licensing arrangements. We support community infrastructures, things like affordable learning. And then in addition to that, we do a great deal of work in the innovation category where we are helping to support new library infrastructures and community-owned types of infrastructures that we think are important for the future of sharing and collaboration. So going forward, just want to give you a picture of the institutions that we support within this consortium, just so that you can kind of get a sense for the types of institutions we're dealing with here. Like I said, this is a really diverse and fairly large group of academic libraries. And I really like to think of PALCI as almost like a microcosm for what's happening in libraries and higher ed more generally in the US. I tend to think that if something's going to work within PALCI, within this diverse group of institutions, again, within that academic context, rather, it may have broad applications elsewhere as well. And so for that reason, I think we're a great testing ground for new strategies and approaches to licensing and owning digital content. Our membership includes 71 members, 6 of which are ARL institutions. We have FTEs ranging from less than 1,000 to greater than 80,000. And all told, we're supporting about 550,000 FTE across our region with access to content and collections, whether that's through resource sharing or collaborative licensing arrangements. We have really widely ranging materials budgets, missions, scope of the institutions that we serve. And for that reason, as we start to think about our approaches, we have to really keep that in mind as we're developing new approaches to licensing content. So as a consortium, we're under increasing pressure to develop solutions that to many of the challenges that higher ed is facing. And that's really apparent when we think about one of our core functions, which is sharing resources. We are faced with questions like, how should we think about the uses and rights associated with digital materials? What do our users expect of us? What can we afford to offer them? And how can we support greater equity in access, knowing that budgets vary widely? And how do we come together around that idea of supporting access to information that's needed by our users? What parameters do we need to negotiate to support access and lending practices when licensing digital content? So we're thinking about all of these things, and these challenges have only increased, really spurred on by a pandemic where electronic access has become just so critical to doing our work. From the PALCI perspective, I mentioned we have our foundations in resource sharing, and I think we've sort of evolved a culture of sharing over time. We started off really focused in on that print side of things where we really understood what it meant to share with each other. We have a program called Easy Borrow, which allows more than 50 of our institutions to connect their disparate ILS library catalogs together in an unmediated way. They can lend and borrow with each other, getting materials quickly to those who need them, sharing those collections within the constraints of our law, of course, and really just making sure that we are able to provide that access that's needed in a way that's also affordable and within those constraints. Over time, we started to see the shift where we knew we needed to be able to provide electronic content, electronic access to content. Within the PALCI Consortium, we attempted to try a number of different models, running into many of the challenges that have been mentioned already today in terms of licensing constraints. We tried demand-driven acquisitions, we tried evidence-based acquisitions models, subscription-based access, and purchases, Policywide purchases, and in some cases, purchases on behalf of subsets of our members. And so we began exploring these new models to try and figure out what approach was going to work in this new environment. Over time, all of those attempts sort of led us toward the idea of developing out collaborative collection strategies. And we're sort of in this phase now where we're trying to take into account how do we leverage or balance the needs of what we need to buy collectively going forward, what we already own, some of which is in print, some of which is electronic, and some of which we only have access rights to, and then how do we share those materials, sometimes in E and sometimes in P, depending on what it is. And so the PALCI Consortium is sort of in this new mode now where we're trying to design those strategies that allow us to leverage diversity and increase our access to collections and services. And we're also in a stage now where we're exploring, what technologies are needed, what partnerships are we required to set up with publishers or other entities to allow us to do some of this exploration and to get to this point which I think is our goal for the future, which is a healthy ecosystem for sharing. Libraries rely on the ability to share with each other. Higher ed in particular is facing a number of challenges where this is just becoming more and more important. And we can no longer assume that the print collections we've had all along will always be there. Print's expensive to store. We know this. Many institutions are weeding those print collections. And as more and more institutions are buying e-preferred methodologies, what does that do to that sharing ecosystem that we've always relied on? So it's sort of, the ground is sort of shifting underneath our feet. And what we're trying to accomplish, I think, within the PALCI Consortium is a thought process that gets us to a place where we know how we are going to sustain that healthy ecosystem of sharing. And to do that in a way that is also respectful of what we value publishers for. We need the content that they are producing, and we want to continue to support them in that activity. So how do we need to balance those needs and get us to that point where we can continue to share? So as we've been thinking about this within the PALCI Consortium, we had a collection summit. This was back in 2018, and I actually spoke briefly about this at a former NISO event a couple years back. And one of the things that our group decided to do was to develop together a series of statements around what our values are as we approach collection strategies. And I'm going to talk mostly about eBooks today because we are thinking about this in the context of resource sharing, but it applies more broadly than just eBooks. And the two that I want to really focus in on, which I think are so critical to consortial roles in this space, are number one, the trust that exists within resource sharing networks and within consortia. That is so critical to being able to try new ideas, test out new theories, figure out what's the right approach for a consortium, and especially one that is diverse. And the second point that I wanted to just really highlight was the statement around honoring and leveraging the diversity of our PALCI community. And when you saw the slide of the names of institutions represented within this regional consortium, it becomes really clear that there are institutions that have different areas of focus, things that they're going to care differently about, different sets of values perhaps around, what is the method of owning versus access? How should we approach, collections? And we wanted to very much recognize those differences rather than sort of sweep them under the rug. We wanted to draw them forward as a point of strength for our consortium as we began to work together on acquiring collections together. So we've needed to define new ways to share. And one thing that we did as a result of that collection summit that I just mentioned, after we set up that set of value statements around how we do collections together, we developed collectively, and I want to give a shout out to my colleagues Angela Carreño and Bill Maltrich at NYU, who really helped spearhead a lot of this thinking, an ebook strategy that was designed to help us create that sustainable, healthy ecosystem for digital content, where we know that we can no longer rely on that print mentality. And so there were a couple of key assumptions that went into designing this new ecosystem, or I'm sorry, this new strategy that we wanted to try with our ebooks acquisitions. The first of which was, we must transition our sharing strategies. People are moving to electronic preferred acquisitions. We must acknowledge that that's happening and examine the different roles that our libraries are playing in that move. The second is that we have an assumption that the market for most purchasing and subscriptions that are happening is mostly saturated. Publishers have gone out, or aggregators or other third parties who are intermediaries in the purchasing process have gone out and tried to sell things. And for the most part, they've done their jobs and they've gotten about what they're going to get in terms of business. So what can we do now that we know that for the most part, those that can afford or could afford access had already purchased it? And what do we do with that assumption in order to increase access to those who do not currently have it? The third is that PALCI members may not always benefit in the same way or equally from the things that we try in terms of our ebook strategies. And that was okay with PALCI members. Again, going back to that value statement around leveraging diversity, there's that sort of, I guess, comfort level with being able to benefit differently from the same type of purchase that we would share across our consortium. Ownership is preferred always because of the concerns that we had about how rights might change over time. So the more that we could own those rights, those perpetual rights to the content, the better. However, access may be okay for some. Second to last there is anchor institutions. And this is a concept where there are institutions within our group that are committing to ebooks acquisitions, regardless of what the consortium does. And how do we leverage that commitment to publishers in a way that benefits everybody else? And then lastly, the diversity and size of our consortia and of the collective institutions gives us a strong buying power and a point to negotiate from for some of those terms that Nancy was mentioning early on in today's talks. So as I mentioned, we think we're a ground that's ripe for testing out new ideas, and we've begun testing our ability to share in the electronic space, leveraging our Policywide purchase agreements to secure frontlist and backlist content with the goal of procuring ebooks that have a variety of points in those terms that we're striving for. First is full ebook ILL rights. And though there aren't always seamless technology options to support that activity, we wanted to guarantee that we had the right to do it. And so that's a point where we used our contract language to build that in, to build that availability in for full ebook ILL rather than just simply chapters or a limited number of pages. The second point is one that I think is really important. We wanted to be able to put that purchased content on a variety of platforms. A lot of times we are choosing between one platform or another, or purchasing things multiple times in order to have it show up in different places. And we said, we really wanted to get a sense of where our users are and to provide that access wherever it is that they are, given that we had purchased unlimited use of a book. So we did negotiate in terms for dual platform access in a couple of different cases, and platform portability rights as well. The third point here is unlimited DRM-free access. This was something that's really critical when you're purchasing at scale across a large consortium. Users expect to be able to access something that they see within a collection. So how can we be able to provide that? Fourth is perpetual ownership rights of both frontlist and backlist. We see a lot of use of our backlist materials and content. We want that to continue to be there. And we purchase those rights rather for each of our individual institutions collectively as a group. And we license that on behalf of all of those institutions participating. And lastly, this is maybe less important than some of the other points, but it is something that we've started to strive for in license agreements, which is alumni access as well. So we've had some initial testing partners and pilot opportunities to begin testing out these terms. And we're in the midst of sort of assessing and evaluating the way that this is impacting the work that we do. We have agreements with Sage and Oxford University Press for wide swaths of frontlist and backlist ebook content that we've purchased from each of those publishers. And we've really preferred to work with publishers directly in this model because of what Brian mentioned, where we wanted to create some mutual understanding and break down the barriers that I think often prevent us from having those really good conversations where we get a chance to figure out what each side is maybe afraid of or things that we're concerned about over the longer term. So we're currently assessing the impact of sharing in this way, where we're sharing the cost of acquisition of ebook content, and we're looking at purchase patterns. One thing that we felt pretty strongly that this model was going to give us was some predictability for our libraries. They know that they'll get this content through PALCI, therefore they can change their buying patterns and reallocate the funds that are needed to the consortial purchase, increasing access across the consortium in the absence of being able to ship those digital copies to each other. And then to be able to use the remaining funds for purchases that are more relevant to just that local institution. So in addition to ebook purchasing strategies, we've also begun to look at other ways of sharing digital content. And one project I want to highlight is Project Reshare. where this project is really focused in on creating a suite of tools that facilitates resource sharing in a modern environment. And I think the thing that is just so important about Project Reshare is the community-owned aspect of it, in which we're able to deal with challenges that come up and develop and change the systems we have to support the needs that the community sees. Where many times with commercial options that are out there, the development that happens in that space happens really slowly at a snail's pace sometimes. And sometimes it doesn't happen at all because it conflicts with business decisions that, that commercial companies need to make. And so Project Reshare is one attempt to deal with that issue and to increase our ability to share. Early days, it's really focused in on print returnable sharing, sort of replacing old systems. But for future, the vision is really how do we empower collective collections in the sharing of digital content as we set up these new standards and approaches to sharing digital content? What systems and technologies are needed to allow that to work really well? So PALCI has been one of the early investors in this and will be one of the first adopters of this new system. And I think this is a good example where PALCI schools have come together to share some risk around what we see as needed innovation in this space, really caused by some of the new friction that's in place, and also some of the old friction that we still haven't quite rid ourselves of, shipping things, whether that's via UPS or mail, and all of the costs that are associated with that. One particular area of interest for me, and I know we're going to hear more about controlled digital lending in a little bit, but is the space for controlled digital lending. And Project Reshare has developed a roadmap for supporting controlled digital lending in the future. And that's something that I hope to see developed. And if you want any more information about this particular project, you can visit projectreshare.org. So just say a quick word about controlled digital lending and the potential, I think, for consortial applications. So CDL, controlled digital lending, offers another mechanism for extending the type of sharing that libraries do every day based on the right of first sale. But of course, it's still very early days, and there are lawsuits occurring at present that I think libraries are leery of, and certainly depending on comfort levels with risk, some are engaging in this today and some are not. But there are certainly pockets of development that are happening all over the country and in Europe as well. And CDL, although it's not a particularly pretty solution, it's expensive, it's time consuming to do controlled digital lending. It's a last resort, but it is so important to access points. And it is a critical way of thinking about accessibility. How do we provide access to our collections to those who, for example, are print disabled? How do we provide access to collections that are no longer accessible because buildings are closed due to a pandemic? So there are all kinds of opportunities here. And what I see happening in terms of libraries implementing CDL is that it's happening in small pockets, many times in hush-hush kind of ways where nobody wants to draw too much attention to themselves as they do this type of lending, even though they may feel that it is very much just an extension of exactly what we're already doing in terms of lending. And it's in many ways just mimicking that that print behavior that we are all accustomed to in terms of lending. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to start to think about, well, what should this look like at scale? How can consortia play a role in organizing our thought process around CDL? And how can we talk with publishers and ensure that the way that we're approaching CDL is done in a way that's respectful of publishers' rights in addition to libraries' rights, and balancing those two things together. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and consortia are just starting to have these conversations together, thinking through, how can we work on this? What are the right approaches? What do our libraries need to have in place in order to feel confident that this is something that they can, in fact, engage in? And there is a community that's been developed around controlled digital lending. It's called the CDLI, Controlled Digital Lending Implementers Group. And I would just encourage you, if you haven't heard of it, to check it out. There's a website there linked in my slides, and I'll share these afterward. But that community is really talking about practical implementations of controlled digital lending. So that's it for me. I will turn it over to Todd and see if there are any questions.
Great, thanks, Jill. Let's see. There was a question. At least I thought there was. It maybe has disappeared.
I see one that is from Jenny Rose Halperin.
Yeah, no, I see
yeah.
the one from Jenny, but I thought there was one earlier, but it seems to have disappeared. I'll try and find it, but while I do, I'll pitch the one from Jenny to you. Do you think it's a question of systems that make CDL ugly and time consuming? Do you think the systems can be built cheaper and easier to do it? Or is it a function of the concept of CDL?
I think it's some of both. I think that there's certainly human elements of controlled digital lending where we have massive print collections that haven't yet been digitized. And there are massive quantities of print that are not for sale in electronic form. And so anytime you're embarking on a process like that, of figuring out what is available to provide digitally, there's going to be human hands that have to touch those materials. It's going to take some time. And depending on, varying levels of comfort with risk, some institutions may be really conservative in that process and some may not be. So I think that's one aspect of it. But I do think that there are still gaps in the systems that are out there and available. They're very much geared towards individual institutions for good reason. You know, if you own that material, then there's a thought that you will have the rights to lend that. There's not scalable solutions that are larger in scope than those individual sort of solutions that exist. And so I think there are plenty of opportunities to improve technology that would help to make CDL less ugly, I suppose, and less onerous for those that are offering it as a service. But we're not there yet, and I think there's still some desire to see lawsuits settled and to make sure that it's the right approach before many institutions are willing to sort of stick their necks out there and go beyond. Project Reshare, though, is working on some scalable solutions, sort of first aimed at individual libraries loaning to their own patrons, and then thinking about, how do you take that and add some efficiencies into that equation, still protecting the rights of publishers just the way we always would, but utilizing those investments we've made in our collections and then sharing it out digitally, sort of skipping that shipping process and increasing accessibility. So I think there's work to be done in all of those areas.
Yeah. Okay, I see what had happened. It was a back and forth quick Q&A with Brian.
Okay.
But actually, I think the question is also pretty relevant to you as well in terms of, you touched a little bit on this, in terms of the role of the consortia in purchasing, say, digital content and licensing it amongst your consortial members. To what extent have you had success in licensing? There are a variety of issues that we're talking about here, but one of them is just getting access. And within that space, have you had success in negotiating with publishers as a consortium to say, realistically, everyone who would have bought it has bought it? How can we, what's the marginal cost for adding, X additional PALCI members who probably didn't want this, couldn't pay for it anyway? Since there's no additional cost, right, for adding that additional library, there's no distribution cost for that additional PALCI member. To what extent have you had success in getting publishers to maybe add the number of institutions without adding to the cost? Have you had success that?
Those are the exact conversations that we're having with publishers. And I think one of the ways that we have those conversations is that we're not necessarily looking for a handout. I think one thing that we're trying to do is to find out what's that incremental cost where we can add access to those remaining institutions who would have normally gotten access through a resource sharing type of a mechanism, where we wouldn't have paid the publisher anything additional in an electronic form. And so what we try to do is have those conversations, and we talk in really frank terms, and we try to have really candid conversations about, here's where we stand, here's where our library's budgets are today, here's what we can bring to the table, what can you help us, how can you help us ensure that level of access that's really needed, where a lot of times what we can do is demonstrate the resource sharing that has gone on before, and demonstrate how we're bringing that into these negotiations, where in the past, this is activity you never saw any piece of. And so here, how do we do this today where we increase that access, and especially equity of access to institutions who couldn't afford it otherwise, not at list prices, not at prices that are even sort of the normal consortial buying club discounts. And so we do that a lot of times by negotiating purchase agreements that are perpetual in nature, really large, Policywide, and we've had a great deal of success with that because there's a win on both sides, and we're always looking for those win-win situations.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. I thought that's where you'd go with this, and I'm glad to give you like, here's a softball. Consortia are so important. All right. Thank you so much, Jill. Appreciate it. And again, want to just highlight there are a number of initiatives working in this space. Um, Jill mentioned several of them. If you get an opportunity, if you want to get more involved, please reach out to those communities and step up and get engaged.